It's January 1675, in an especially icy winter. A Wampanoag Christian minister, John Sassamon, leaves his home at the praying town of Namaskett and makes the 15-mile journey to Plymouth. Even buried under snow, he knows these roads well. He knows this whole area well. He's been a guide and interpreter for the English and his own kin for his entire adult life. But this time, he's alone. Crunching through the snow, he makes good time, and he soon arrives at the oldest English town in New England. The people know him, and he returns their friendly greetings, but he's not here for chit-chat. He walks to the home of Josiah Winslow, the governor of Plymouth Colony, and asks to speak with him. He's welcomed into the governor's home and brought close to the fire to warm up. After some polite small talk, Winslow asks what has brought him all the way here in this cold weather. It must be important. It is, whispers Sassamon. He brings word that Philip, sachem of the Wampanoag, is conspiring against the English. He's making alliances with other sachems and Sonsquas, and he's mustering an army. Sassamon grabs the governor's hand. His own life is in danger if Philip discovers he's warned the English. Winslow removes his hand and calms the shivering man. He's only been governor for a year or two, but he's been part of colonial politics for years. They get word that the Indians are plotting against them all the time, every couple of years, and it never comes to much. If it's just a rumour, there's nothing to worry about. If there's some truth to it, well, it's nothing that a show of force won't put to bed. He nevertheless thanks Sassamon for his warning and escorts him to his door. There's no suggestion of a reward or of protection. Sassamon goes out into the snow, and within a week, he disappears. John Sassamon's body is found in February, submerged under the ice of Assawamsett Pond, right next door to Namaskett. His body is bruised, bloated, and with injuries to his neck. His gun and his hat are found on the shore. He was fished out and buried according to his Christian faith, but questions surrounded his death. How had he died? Who, if anyone, had killed him? And why? Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 4, Episode 15, CSI New England. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Sam Hume. Last time, we saw the change of leadership of the Wampanoag. The venerable Sassamon, who had helped the Pilgrims survive their first years, died, and his eldest son, Alexander, became sachem. But when he too died shortly after, his younger brother, Philip, or Metacom, took over. We also saw how the New England colonies were united, but especially where they weren't, like Rhode Island, which was still the black sheep of the New England family. We also covered one of my favourite interactions from this period, Weetamoo, the Sonsqua of the Pocasets, cunning use of colonial rivalry to balance one group of settlers against the other and ultimately keep her land hers. But that strategy couldn't last forever. Today, we'll see the beginning of the end for Wampanoag independence. But first, let's rewind a few years. In 1671, the Sonsqua of the Saugknecht, Awashonks, was summoned by the Plymouth Council. Awashonks and the Saugknecht were Wampanoag, part of the Wampanoag Confederation, and she's been just out of frame of the narrative. She was a neighbour of Weetamoo, and her land had also been claimed by the Talman Deed. Now her territory was once again under threat. Plymouth Council's summons hadn't been an invitation. If the Sonsqua didn't attend, they were prepared to use military force to bring her in. So, Awashonks arrived at the summer court and signed tenders of peace and articles of agreement. Agreeing to these terms, Awashonks submitted to Plymouth's authority, Although this doesn't seem to mean she was outright annexed. It did mean that the Sanskrit agreed to surrender all the guns under her control and listed all the men in her community which were included in this submission. John Sassamon was, of course, one of the translators and signatories. The reason for this forced submission is very familiar to us by now: land. Josiah Winslow, future governor of Plymouth, was one of the 3 leading Plymouth men who had an interest in Awashonk's land. But the submission didn't get them what they wanted. In later correspondence, Awashonks successfully makes clear that her land is still her own, and she'd only sell what she wanted to sell. The Plymouth settlers tried another strategy in 1673. They turned to Awashonks' eldest son, Mamanua, and after making sure he was receptive to their deal, the Plymouth court declared that, as the son of the previous sachem, he had more right to the land than his mother. You see, Awashonks had kept her position as Sonsqua after her husband's death because of her skill and the respect she held, but she wasn't from a particularly high-status family. Under English law and custom, with her husband's death, her eldest son now outranked her. This sounded great for Mamanua, who had fallen out with his mother already. Mamanua accepted the court's decision and promptly offered to sell the land to his new colonist friends. Well, not if Awashonks had anything to say about it. In spring 1674, Mamanua arrived on the land he'd agreed to sell to the English and found his mother, his stepdad, and several family members waiting for him. This was an intervention, and not a gentle one. Mamanua was tied up, and his mother read him the riot act. "What the hell do you think you're doing, trying to sell my land out from under me, you little brat?" The rest of his family wasn't much nicer. He'd tried to cheat his family and community, and they weren't having it. After this humiliating experience, Mamanua was cut free and sent on his way. By Wampanoag standards, he'd been ceremonially humbled, stripped of any authority he might have claimed as the son of a sachem, and forced to acknowledge his responsibilities to his people. But Mamanua had alternatives, and he now turned to his new friends at Plymouth. In July 1674, Plymouth Court heard Mamanua's testimony, how his mother, the, quote, pretended squaw sachem, end quote, had attacked, insulted, bound, and threatened him. The court, led by new governor Josiah Winslow, found in his favour. Winslow was, of course, one of the proposed buyers of Awashonk's land, which I'm sure didn't influence his decision one bit. Mamanua was confirmed to be able to sell the land, and in weeks, English settlers were chopping down trees. So, why have I mentioned this affair? Because it's part of a wider push by the leadership of Plymouth into Wampanoag lands in the years before the outbreak of war. This push was contested and resisted by their native inhabitants, but also aided by indigenous collaborators, who saw their interests as best served by working with the colonists. Collaborators like Mamanua, who used English backing to assert his authority against his hated mother, and, like John Sassamon, who found a lucrative position as a mediator between the two cultures. But people were getting wise to Sassamon's unreliability. As we covered last time, Philip drew up a new will in the 1660s, which Sassamon wrote down for him. This seemed a perfectly reasonable thing. Philip could not read or write, and Sassamon could. Sassamon had also married into the sachem's family, which might explain why he was given such a trusting role, and also why the new will made him one of its greatest beneficiaries. Or maybe not. Maybe Philip offered to give him some land on his death, and Sassamon fudged the exact amount when he wrote it down. In 1671, Philip abruptly dismisses Sassamon from his court. Exactly why isn't clear. He could have decided that Sassamon's closeness to the English was no longer an asset, or he'd finally had enough of his proselytizing. Sassamon was a Christian minister. Or he'd had someone else read his will and discovered that cheeky scribe had tried to cheat him. Whatever the reason, Sassamon ceases to be included in Philip's close circle. But he was still a valuable and useful asset in the New England land game, so we see him appear in more deeds and agreements over the next few years, such as in March 1674, when he appears as the beneficiary of a deed from Tuspequin, sachem of Namasket. In this deed, Tuspequin grants Sassamon nearly 100 acres of land at Assawamsett Neck. 2 days after this deed was acquired, the Plymouth court authorized the expansion of the town of Middlebury, which sat right next to Assawamsett Neck. So far, this looks like Sassamon was working as the colonists' agent, securing the land for their expansion. However, Sassamon's new deeds from Tuspequin overrode an earlier grant of land from the sachem from the previous summer. This deed had granted land to one Benjamin Church and John Thompson. Plymouth Court had authorized Thompson and Church's father-in-law, Constance Southworth, to force the sale of land to expand Middlebury. So this wasn't Sassamon smoothing over the Middlebury expansion. This was him getting in the way of it. So why? Like so much of these events, we can only make assumptions. It can't be a coincidence that Sassamon acquired this new deed just days before the court agreed to the Middlebury expansion, and that land suddenly became much more valuable. A cynical viewer of Sassamon's actions could see this as him trying to claim a share of what could be a very profitable sale of land. Less cynically, Sassamon lived in Namasket. Assawamsett Neck was Sassamon's home, and he knew full well how tenuous native land ownership turned out to be when colonial governments set their eyes on it. This new deed could simply be him securing his and his family's home with an up-to-date deed which Plymouth Court had to acknowledge. But, whatever the reason, Sassamon now held a competing deed to the one his colonial friends wanted to use, and it was for the same land where his body would be discovered less than a year later. As we saw in the cold open, John Sassamon came to Plymouth in January 1675 and told Governor Winslow that Philip was conspiring against the English. He later disappeared, and his body was found in Assawamsett Pond in February. Traditional histories immediately point to murder, his killers as Philip's closest counsellors, and their motive as punishment for betraying Wampanoag plans to the English. But this isn't the only theory. If it was murder, there's no shortage of people with motive. As we've covered over the last few episodes, John Sassamon was a wheeler and dealer, always on hand to smooth over land transactions. Many of these deals were contested after the fact, on the grounds of misunderstandings or disagreements over the exact terms or boundaries. Sassamon's work as interpreter, translator, and scribe put him front and centre of all these disputes. This could be put down to him just being very bad at his job, if not for the fact these misunderstandings tended to favour himself or his friends. If Philip had ordered Sassamon's death, it could have been for any of these questionable land transactions, or because the will Sassamon wrote for Philip had made himself the main beneficiary. Alternatively, Sassamon's killers could have had their own grudges, either because of land disputes or due to religion. Sassamon was a Christian minister, and he was highly enthusiastic about converting his Wampanoag relations to the foreign religion. Could someone have finally had it with his proselytizing, and murdered him now that he was out of Philip's favour and protection? Maybe. There's also the possibility he was murdered by colonists. As we just saw, Sassamon had done a wee bit of insider trading. Knowing that Assawamsett Neck was about to be sold to Church and other colonists, he'd quickly drafted deeds which put him as their owner. Not only was this the land where he was found dead, but his death made that deed void. There's the final option, that no one killed Sassamon, that it was an accident, that he'd been walking or hunting on the icy pond, it had cracked, and he'd fallen in. His struggles to save himself would explain the injuries to his body, especially if he tried to pull himself over the jagged edge of the ice. Unsurprisingly, Wampanoag sources favoured this explanation, with John Easton, Deputy Governor of Rhode Island, being told that if Philip had wanted Sassamon dead, he'd have done it openly. His execution would have been justified for trying to defraud the sachem. To order his murder and then to try and hide the body and disguise it as an accident wasn't something they said they'd ever heard of before. But they were saying this in the aftermath of what comes next, when tensions are rapidly spiraling out of control, so the people telling Easton this were not objective themselves. Sassamon's warning became much more believable with his mysterious death, and Philip attended Plymouth Court at the end of February to clear everything up. He denied plotting against the English, but, of course, the court didn't believe him. They had no evidence to hold him, though, so thought it best to let him leave as a friend. The court then sent summons to many people who lived near Assawamsett Pond, including Christian Indians from Namaskett, and when the court assembled on the 1st of March, these people were questioned. But none of them said they'd seen anything of interest and had no idea what had happened to their minister. It looked like a wash. But then, a few days later, another Christian Indian arrived in Plymouth and gave testimony that he had seen Sassamon murdered, and even better, he could name the killers: Tobias, his son Wamapapaquan, and Matashinanimo. All three were counsellors of Philip. Governor Winslow acted swiftly. The three men were arrested at Namaskett, and their bail was set, a bond for ownership of their land at Namaskett. Tobias was bailed, but his son was kept imprisoned. This was technically against colonial law. Bail was not allowed to be granted to those accused of murder. But, as Lisa Brooks suggests, they wanted Tobias's land more than they wanted him. A deed was soon granted by Tobias, formally acknowledging all the land around Assawamsett Pond, where Sassamon had been found, as part of the growing English settlement of Middlebury. With the land deal made, perhaps Tobias expected his son to be released, now that the colonists had what they wanted. This had been the pattern before, as we've seen. Instead, Tobias was taken back into custody for his trial. A jury of 12 Englishmen and 6 of the, quote, most indifferentest, gravest, and sage Indians was assembled, and they heard the evidence against the accused. The witness, a Christian Indian named Patterson, testified that he'd been hidden when the 3 men had accosted and murdered Sassamon. Then, a coroner's report, ordered by Governor Winslow, was presented. Sassamon's body was exhumed, and the cause of his death established. His neck had been broken by a twisted head. This was, quote, the way the Indians sometimes use when they practice murder, end quote. Then came reports that when Sassamon's body was pulled from the pond, no water poured out of it. If he had drowned, water would have been in his lungs. This suggested that he was dead before he went into the lake. So far, so similar to any modern murder trial. But then the corpse was brought forward, and Tobias was ordered to approach it. When he did, the body of John Sassamon, dead for nearly half a year, apparently began to bleed. This was a long-standing belief that a victim of murder would freshly bleed in the presence of their killer. Against this witness testimony, circumstantial and miraculous evidence, the accused only had their word. They denied any role in Sassamon's death. Philip himself repeated his position, that if he wanted Sassamon dead, he'd have had him executed, as was his right. But the jury came to a unanimous decision. Guilty. The sentence was death. On the 8th of June 1675, Tobias, Wampapaquan, and Matashinanimo were hanged. Well, almost. Tobias's son, Wampapaquan, had a last-minute reprieve. Either before he went to the gallows or after his rope snapped, Wampapaquan confessed. He confessed to murdering Sassamon and said that it was on Philip's orders. This saved his life, for a few days, before he was shot by firing squad. As you can imagine, Philip was furious with the execution of his subjects. Even if they were guilty of murdering Sassamon, which he doesn't seem to have believed they were, this was still an outrageous violation of his authority. He was the sachem of the Wampanoag. If the men deserved execution, he would decide that and he would carry it out. The last-minute confession of Wampapakwan, albeit under the very real threat of death, gave Plymouth what they needed. Here, from the horse's mouth, was proof that Philip was guilty of ordering Sassamon's murder. At the very least, it justified bringing the sachem in. Governor Winslow got to work with pen and paper. To Philip, he ordered him to disarm and come to Plymouth along with his councillors, those the English hadn't hanged, that is, to answer the charges. Philip sent word back, saying he'd love to. He didn't want things to escalate, but he just couldn't ignore the feeling that his life would be in danger if he did what Winslow asked. Brooks suggests that Winslow never expected this letter to bring Philip to court, and that this was instead just part of English understandings of a just war. Before hostilities began, there should always be some attempt to resolve things peacefully. Winslow was certainly not sitting idle as he waited for the reply. He dashed off letters to his neighbours and allies, native and settler. The other colonies of New England received calls for aid, and Winslow also reached out to Weetamoo, sister-in-law to Philip. Addressing both her and her new husband, Ben, Winslow urged the Pocasset to back the English in any coming war. In this letter, Winslow lays it on pretty thick. Philip was acting, quote, contrary to his many promises and engagements, upon no provocation in the least from us, end quote. If Philip did start a war, entirely on his own and for no reason whatsoever, well, it would be great if Weetamoo backed the English. Winslow acknowledges the pressure currently being applied to the Pocasset, but only as, quote, mischief invented by Philip. If Weetamoo was to ignore her brother-in-law's mischief, cut ties with him, and back the English, Winslow offered protection from Philip and, implicitly, from the English, who would march against the Wampanoag sachem. In return, the Pocasset would surely gain greatly from a victory over Philip. Weetamoo was not convinced. Whatever her feelings on Philip, she clearly cared for her sister, and she sent messages to Montauk, Philip's town. These messengers almost certainly took with them the contents of Winslow's letter, which made it very clear that Plymouth was trying to isolate Philip in preparation for war. Meanwhile, John Easton, the deputy governor of Rhode Island, met with Philip. As we've seen, Rhode Island was usually more cooperative and sympathetic to their indigenous neighbours, and the same is true here. Easton and Philip sat together, and the governor and the sachem hashed it out. Both men agreed that fighting was the worst way to resolve the growing issues between the Wampanoag and the colonists. But what was the alternative? Easton suggested arbitration, and Philip dismissed it out of hand. He and many other native leaders had suffered from English arbitration for decades. Quote, all English agreed against them, and, quote, many miles square of land so taken from them, end quote. Colonial courts were unsafe, as had just been shown by the execution of the three men. Easton records in his own personal account that Patuxent, the Christian Indian whose testimony had secured their conviction, had owed a debt to one of the condemned. By falsely testifying against them, he then didn't have to pay them back. Philip brought up previous times where he and other leaders had agreed to surrender their weapons as a show of good faith, only to be forced to buy them back at extortionate rates of English money or native land. When they discussed the rumours of native conspiracy, Philip cursed the name of John Sassamon for doing so much to fan those flames. Philip also, again, denied Plymouth having any authority over him. The governors of New England were merely subjects of the distant King Charles, whereas Philip was a sachem, a ruler in his own right. He retold the history of Wampanoag-English relations, how his father had welcomed and supported the colonists in their precarious early days, and how the new generation of settlers was not returning the favour. Roaming English cattle reappears as a grievance, and the suspicious death of Alexander comes up again. Philip had not forgotten his brother's suspected poisoning. To quote from Brooks, just as many colonial statements censured the Wampanoag's failure to act as proper subjects to the colonial government, the Wampanoag leader's statement critiqued the newcomers' failure to participate in the indigenous system of reciprocal relations. If, as Easton warned, they should avoid war at all costs because the English were too strong for them, then, they retorted, the English should do to them as they did when they were too strong for the English. Easton acknowledged the drawbacks of previous arbitration and proposed an alternative. Philip would choose a native sachem, one not involved in the current disputes, and the colonists would pick the governor of New York, who was likewise distant enough to have no direct interest. Both Plymouth and the Wampanoag would present their cases and their grievances. The sachem and the governor would judge the situation on English and indigenous principles and resolve the issues without resorting to war. Apparently, Philip really liked the idea, and Easton left the meeting convinced that this was the path away from conflict. He returned home, eager to send out the proposal to all his fellow governors, but when he returned to Rhode Island, he found a letter waiting for him. It was from Governor Winslow of Plymouth, informing Easton that the United Colonies, on unspecific grounds and with unclear objectives, was going to wage war against Philip. Easton recorded, "In a week's time after we had been with the Indian, the war thus begun." Before we finish, 2 pieces of news. First, I'm attending the podcast show in London this week, so if you're also going, it would be great to meet up. Second, Kurzgesagt Night Shift just released a gorgeously animated video on the history of ninja, and I wrote the script for it. It was so much fun, and somewhat appropriately for the topic, it was tricky to get to the truth. There's a link in this episode description, or you can search Kurzgesagt Night Shift in YouTube. Their main channel is more to do with science, but Night Shift is for history topics. This ninja video is only the first one I've written for the Kurzgesagt team, so if you really enjoy it, you should definitely subscribe, because more are on the way. Thank you to my Patreon House of Lords, which has been joined by Earl Corrin, Earl Tristan, Earl Nathan, and Earl Panzer. They join my existing patrons, including the King's favourites Mike Sanders and Jarrow Kotowski, the Duchess of Wellington Sue Bremner, the Marquess of Bedfordshire Mason Barney, and the Earl of Westmoreland Riccardo Tenorio. Thank you to all of my patrons, those I've mentioned and those I haven't. If you're not a patron and you're on the fence about becoming one, for just $5 a month you can listen to this episode and every other episode ad-free. Patrons also receive the monthly Britannica Gazette Q&A and a Patreon-only chat room. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica for more information. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in this episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.